Inflation through the roof.
Grocery prices up 11% year over year.
Censorship of dissident voices. Freezing of bank accounts.
Justin Trudeau invoking emergency powers against the truckers. Banks can now freeze their personal accounts, the accounts of anyone linked to the Freedom Convoy.
Digital surveillance and communism spreading.
What do we want?
Basic income!
With the basic income, I felt a sense of security because I didn't have to worry about not going hungry, and I didn't have to worry about being kicked out of my apartment.
The government is on the verge of bankruptcy, and they're coming for your money.
Is Canada's federal debt increasing in real time, now surpassing $1.2 trillion. This debt is draining taxpayer dollars, with interest alone costing $54 billion this year.
It's time to break free and start saving in money they can't take from you. Since 2013, the folks at Bull Bitcoin have one mission: destroy central banking. Bull Bitcoin is the most trusted Bitcoin company in Canada. They empower you to buy, sell, and pay bills with Bitcoin. They are 100% non-custodial, which means that you always maintain full control over your Bitcoin, allowing you to reclaim your financial sovereignty and secure your wealth for the future. Their customer support will assist you throughout the whole process, helping you get your hands on the hardest money ever created. Escape their financial gulag, click on the link below, and start buying Bitcoin today and get a $20 bonus as a listener of Liberty Dispatch. Well, friends, it is a pleasure to have on Liberty Dispatch interviews my unintentional, slightly reddish twin, Alex Kloosterman. Alex is a teaching pastor at Hill City Baptist Church in Peterborough, Ontario. He co-hosts the Dominion podcast. He's also the co-owner of Resistance Coffee Company. That's where him and I got these beautiful sweaters. You can read more of the posts and listen to the podcast over at dominionpress.substack.com. He and his wife, Rebecca, have been married since 2010. Together, they have two wonderful girls. Alex, great to have you on the show. Thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me, brother. Always fun.
So this discussion we're going to have today is really just an extension of both the discussion we had recently, but really we've been having on and off for the last couple of years, whether it's in person, on Messenger, on Signal, just trying to talk through what's going on in our country, make sense of what Christians need to be doing, how they need to be operating. And so I've personally had several discussions with different pastors, different believers over the last couple of weeks as we've seen the election of Donald Trump and the effect of some of his rhetoric on Canada and really the changes that have been happening in our own country. And we've been talking about, do we join the U.S., part of us, all of us? What about the U.S. annexing us, the effect the tariffs are having, the conservative Liberal Party? You did a podcast, two podcasts actually, that I kind of wanted to have as a foundation for our discussion. One of them was on the importance of explicitly Christian political engagement, is people being unashamedly, explicitly Christian in their political engagement. And you also did a podcast more recently on patriotism. What is patriotism? What does it mean to be Canadian? What does it mean to love Canada? And I think those two discussions, or those two podcasts, which I want to commend our audience to listen to, matter in light of the recent happenings in Canada. So I want to start off our discussions. We can't read hearts and minds. We can go by what we see, what we hear, and what we can infer. What do you think ultimately the point of the tariffs is? They're on, they're off, they're on, and now they're on again, but only on certain things. Apparently, just recently they're back on, but only on certain things. And then as of April 2nd, they're back on again for other things. What do you think the play is? What do you think the desired outcome is with these tariffs?
Well, I think some of the answer to that question is speculative. Let's start with what Trump has actually said. I mean, ostensibly, the reasons that he's given are primarily economic and security focused. So he, as far as the interests of the United States are concerned, he began by drawing attention to the fentanyl that's coming across the border from Canada and border problems in general. And the first thing we have to say is, like, this is a legitimate concern. The Canadian Border Services are an absolutely corrupt and incompetent organization, at least in its leadership. I'm not speaking to every single employee of that organization. Like with most institutions in Canada, there's good people in most of them. But the managerial class is almost completely self-serving and corrupt. And so a whistleblower recently came out from the Canadian Border Services saying things, um, like there's essentially no vetting process in Canada. People think there is. If you show up and claim refugee status or seek asylum, that you are approved unless you literally tell them you've killed someone. Like the de facto position is not stop and who are you? It's actually let them in unless you have a reason not to. The board that oversees a lot of these things is just some woke, far left, extremist, radical group. Even the machines that they use to scan certain paperwork, if you put a white piece of paper in it, it flashes green. Like we don't have a border, which does raise the question of, if you don't have a border, are you a sovereign nation? And the answer to that is no. And we're going to get more into this, so I won't go down that rabbit hole yet, but there's a legitimate problem with the security of Canada and the security of the United States through Canada. Now, the media has been downplaying the amount of fentanyl that's been going into the States, but that's a very misleading number when they say it's about 1%. The amount that we have going to the States is enough to kill millions of people. So it's a misleading piece of propaganda to just state the percentage of fentanyl that's stopped. So I think there is a legitimate security threat. And then you think about the Arctic, and geopolitically, you think, well, Russia and China have both shown interest in the Arctic. That the Canadian Arctic security doesn't exist, and we no longer live in a world where the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean are enough to and the southern neighbor to keep us safe. And I think we've seen the foreign policy of the United States shift too. When you think about Europe, they expect people now to defend themselves and to pay their way. They're saying, look, we're not going to be the policemen of the world. We're not going to defend everybody on our dime and in our blood. If NATO wants help, they need to pay up. If Europe wants support, they need to man up as well. And so this could just be a part of a kind of a defensive posture from the States as well, saying we're not trusting our defense to Canada, and nor should they. And then I think as well, the last thing on security is, Sam Cooper has revealed some pretty startling statistics regarding the nature of Chinese influence in Canada. If he's correct, and it seems like he is, the Vancouver housing market, even Toronto for that matter, has been almost completely dictated by foreign influence. Which, if you think about what that means to our economy and to the lives of everyday Canadians, this is insane, and we're talking, I'm not going to get into all the numbers, but there's a legitimate, and then you look at the political interference by the CCP, and the Americans have to know all of this. So I think there's a case to be made that Canada is a vassal state of China, functionally, economically, political interference. Now you look at Carney's ties to Chinese banks. If I'm the U.S. president and looking at Canada, a socialist state that has no border, that is a vassal state of China, that the managerial class, it's not just a ruler. And this is the other thing, is they know that these problems aren't just owing to a government, it's owing to a culture, a cultural collapse of responsibility, of honor, of truth, and so it's like, what's the likelihood that something's going to change with the change in government? So I think there is a legitimate threat to the States. I think economically, they want to consolidate. The tariffs are meant to drive industry back down to the States. The auto tariffs they just put in place yesterday, the purpose of that is to get auto manufacturing to move down to the States. And so it's a country first, U.S. first policy, which in some ways I understand it's going to hurt us. And it does remain to be seen the consequences on the states for their allies. Like, there's a tightrope that Trump is walking here, because he is on one hand trying to put the interests of his nation first, which he should, and that is his duty. On the other hand, relations with allies and trade partners are a part of the national interest. And so I don't know if he expected the pushback that he's getting. I don't know if he looked at the weak polling of the Liberals and thought that indicated that there'd be widespread support for him, which is not the case. I'm not sure, but that's probably further down the line. So those are his stated reasons. Anything beyond that, I think, is speculation. And I can't say. He's definitely trying to disrupt us. Like the whole, I'm going to do a tariff on this day, and then I'm going to postpone it, and then I'm going to have a press conference tomorrow, and put in he's trying to be disruptive. He's trying to put us on our toes. The most generous thing is to say he wants to renegotiate our trade deal, and he's just putting us through the ringer first so that we come to the table desperate and willing to accept any concessions or whatever, to make any concessions. So
even his comment recently where he would rather have a liberal in power than a conservative.
Yeah.
He has to know that is going to have effects, like significant effects in Canada, because I'm sure there are a number of people who were considering voting for, Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives, who like Trump, who like his policies, and who maybe wish Poilievre was a little bit more like Trump in that regard, a little bit more kind of that, bring that MAGA movement up here, who hear a comment like that and really don't know what to make of it, because that's just that's like having your dad, who is an idol. He's so massive in your eyes. Mm-hmm. And then this other guy who also is a very important, influential person in your life. And then having the two of them now disagree and say, I'd rather, one's better than the other, I don't like this guy anymore, like that would have quite the impact on a child. Yes. And I would argue that the majority of Canadians are only slightly more intelligent and rational than children, so they would be thoroughly upset by the comments made by Donald Trump. It's an interesting time, to say the least. There's been a lot of responses. The whole Vancouver money laundering scheme also, I think, has been downplayed. Yeah, not just the housing, but the way that the money is cleaned through casinos. Right? Why would you have
our national banks?
Yeah. Why would you have four nationals come to BC and drop millions of dollars and seemingly just throw it away into the hands of the casino? They have no desire to win. And Sam Cooper's exposing, well, that's one of the ways that you actually get the money cleaned and then used or put into another place. So, Alex, one of the, I guess, speculative ideas regarding the tariffs, and this would kind of tie in well with Trump's support of rather having a liberal than conservative, would be that one of the things he's after actually seeing a weaker Canada, weaker economically, weaker socially, which would make the situation ripe for either saying, okay, Canada, we're gonna take over from here, Canada. You tried, you had 175 years, but now we're gonna take over. We're gonna take your land. We're gonna make this happen. Or make things so bad that Canada will come to the table, say, okay, I guess we do need to, like you said, not only renegotiate, but maybe we need to join in, or at the very least, maybe individual provinces or citizens would say, okay, we need to become a part of the United States. So one of the things that we've talked about, one of the things that we've discussed is that potential. So I guess walk us through not only your perspective, but kind of also grounded biblically, the idea of either all of Canada joining the United States or individual provinces join the United States, or the possibility that, let's just say that Trump is indeed a expansionist light globalist who likes the idea of a North American Union and really just wants to subsume Canada into the United States in order to provide the best economic, military protection he can for the United States, which he loves because he is America first. How are we supposed to think about and respond to these possibilities? Canada joining, a province joining, or indeed the United States saying, "Okay, we're gonna annex you now. We're gonna take you over and free you from, whatever tyrants are running the show there."
So I think we need to start from first principles, and a lot of the disagreements surrounding this question and how you respond to potential annexation or a referendum and a vote to become part of the United States as another state has to do with how you think through the nature of a nation and what do you think patriotism is. And I think a nation is in its fundamental sense a family of families. It is a covenantal union. It is an objective relationship with objective duties and corresponding responsibilities. And it is comprised of, obviously many families, but many different spheres of responsibility as well, including the state. And I think part of the problem is Canadians have reduced patriotism to mean a love and loyalty of the state and its interests over a love and loyalty of the actual citizens. And if you actually conflate the state and the nation, then by definition, anything that you do that is out of step with the state, any kind of dissent, even though it's for the best interests of your neighbors and your family and the actual citizens of Canada, is seen as seditious. And I just reject this framing outright as an unbiblical framing. It's a statist framing of patriotism and loyalty and nationalism. And it is characteristic of a post-national state. Like a post-national state is an ideology that's basically meant to sever all bonds of loyalty that exist between people and anything else but the state. So when I think through what it means to be Canadian and what it means to be patriotic, I don't think primarily in terms of my agreement, my loyalty and allegiance and love for the governing authorities. That is part of it. But I think primarily in terms of my love and allegiance to the values historically, to the customs or laws historically, to the people, and not just people who are here today, but generationally as well. I think about people in the past as well. My allegiance, patriotism, comes from the root word of father, right? And it carries the idea of love for our fathers. And so I think about what Canada once was and my duty to that. So if we think about it in those terms, then the greatest threat to Canada for the last 10 years has been the Canadian state. And I would say the managerial class, the ruling class in particular, who actively, explicitly oppose Canadian values, Canadian customs and laws, and who oppress the Canadian people. My position presently is that Canada is a tyrannical state by definition and its very nature. And I think that's a very simple case to make, and that the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which functions as our highest legislation, to which all other legislation is subservient to, it has been revealed through the ruling of the courts through the last 5 years that we do not live under the rule of law, but the law of the rulers, that even the highest law of our land allows for rulers to set aside that law, which means in principle and in function that the highest law of the land is in fact the rulers. We saw another example of this just yesterday, I think it was, with the horrific ruling that came out by the courts, the Supreme Court, in the case of the boy who died and it was ruled a vaccine death. His father took this to court, this tragedy, and the government ruled that public health has no duty of care towards the citizens, that they cannot be held responsible for their actions. So what this means in principle is that the government can coerce your child into a medical practice that kills your child, but they bear no moral culpability. And so I think structurally, Canada is a tyrannical state. And what that means practically is that we need to, the need of the hour is to actually reestablish the rule of law and to begin a cultural renewal and reform. So now when we have the question of annexation, I'm thinking in terms of what is best to uphold Canadian values, Canadian law as an expression of those values, and the worship. I mean, the root of a nation is its worship, and all values flow from worship, and all customs are a reflection of our values, all laws. So I think you trying to fabricate some image of a nation apart from its God is an illusion. It doesn't exist. It's a giant myth. So, I
So if
want to.
I just want to boil that down so I make sure that it comes together. So what you're saying is, as Canadians, we should be loyal to the nation, not to the state. And when the state is being entirely disloyal to the nation, not doing its God appointed duty, and also acting as a tyrant and overriding the laws that we've all agreed upon, in that instance, loyalty to the nation and thus obedience to God requires the correction or removal of the state. And in this case, if that were to come from the outside, regardless of the intent, that Canadians shouldn't balk at that, but we should say, for the sake of the nation that we're ultimately loyal to, and for the sake of the rule of law, these evil leaders need to be removed. And if that comes from the outside, we can't look at that and say that's immoral and that's wrong and we shouldn't support it. Is that an accurate summary?
Like what is seditious? So if our governing class, for example, has been compromised through the Communist Party of China, which it increasingly seems like there's a huge amount of that. And make an extreme example, okay? Let's make an extreme example. Let's say it comes out that our fairly elected officials, all of them, without a doubt, everyone across the board politically knows and understands that they are under Chinese influence, which means that they are traitors. I think there it reaches a point where everyone acknowledges, hold on a second, who's the traitor? The person who opposes traitors or the person who joins with traitors? And I think that everyone has a limit in their mind. They can understand that at some point, the state no longer functions in the best interests of the nation, and that they themselves are seditious. And that it is a matter of patriotism and patriotic duty for the defense of the nation to oppose them. Now, so that's the principle. I think a lot of people. There's a disagreement there. Now, there are a lot of conversations that follow from that. What is the best course of action? So what I'm not saying is, having established that principle, which I think is irrefutable, that the best thing is for Donald Trump to take over Canada. That's not what I'm saying. I'm simply saying that a posture of acknowledging the tyranny and the treasonous nature of our state, and recognizing that our loyalty is not ultimately to them, but to our people and our values, is not a seditious position. It's actually the patriotic position. And those things need to be separated, because the same thing happened during COVID, right? Like, we were told that we had to do everything the state said, otherwise we were that we were seditious, that we were anti-Canadian. We were opposed to our neighbors when everything that we were doing as pastors and citizens was for our neighbors. The same play was run on the Freedom Convoy, right? Try to treat them as a fringe minority of rabble-rousers and rebels. But actually, the Freedom Convoy was a bunch of patriots who are standing up for the rule of law, who are standing up for the rights and freedoms and the values of Canada. And they were doing so in a lawful way. So I think the same play is being run on us right now, frankly.
So, do you think it'd be fair to say that there's disagreement not only over that principle, but maybe there's as much or maybe more disagreement over, are we at the point at which necessarily we can oppose them? You know what I mean? Like, I think if there's, so I think what we saw during the COVID was that a lot of essentially all of the churches, the private citizens who said, we will defy your lawless mandates because we adhere to a higher law, what they ultimately assumed was that defiance of, dissent toward and opposition to the state are good and right and God-pleasing. So we all agree on that, especially when the state is functioning outside of their jurisdiction and working for the harm of its citizens. I think the question that some wrestle with during COVID, the way they tried to frame it was, because it's not overt persecution, it's not time yet. I wonder if maybe there's a similar question floating around circles right now, that we would agree the principle that if Canada was overtly tyrannical, hostile, and coming against its citizens with, violence and with imprisonment, that absolutely at that point there is a moral argument for resistance to tyranny, even in a more, offensive nature that wouldn't be seditious. I guess the question is, there's probably people who are thinking, but we're not there yet. Yes, we agree that if we get there, we have to. It's not treasonous to say the tyrants have to go, but the disagreement is, are they that level of tyrant yet, or is there a certain threshold of, is it just tyranny in general, or is there a threshold of tyranny when it becomes violence? I guess I'm wondering if maybe disagreement is there as well. And so I don't know if you've had those discussions where people would agree with you. No, absolutely. There's a point at which it crosses a line, but maybe we just haven't crossed that line yet. Like, are people drawing those lines in different places?
I think there's a distinction between what is permissible and what is strategic. And that's a valid conversation. So I think you can reach the point where you acknowledge that Canada is a tyrannical, lawless state. And that's just a fact. And then what do you do about that in the moment? And how do you work against that? How do you resist that? Is open for a debate. And there's many tacks you can take. I don't, however, think that it is legitimate to say Canada is not a tyrannical state and to base that on the degree to which we are persecuted. And this came up during COVID. This was the argument. This was the argument that people made. They said, you're not being persecuted because people in China are in prison. So it's shame on you for calling it persecution. And I think Joe Boot is the one who wrote an article that was helpful. It's like the degree of persecution doesn't establish the legitimacy of it. Mm-hmm. And so by that account, no one in China is suffering for imprisonment if people in Nigeria are being beheaded. Mm-hmm. Right? Is that really where we want to go? That really,
well, I think an analogy would be helpful for people to drill down, because I also think the analogy is helpful in answering these questions about the appropriateness of either seeking outside help or outside help coming. Let's say you have two families, and in one family you have a dad who is massively physically abusive. He beats people in his family. He is emotionally and verbally abusive in what he says. I mean, he's a monster. He is a tyrant in his home. Then you have another family, and in this family, the dad doesn't physically beat his kids, but he does use coercion and fear and terror and the threats of what he could do. And he's clearly demeaning and clearly vindictive with his words. no one would look at those two situations and say, if you're in the second family where your dad isn't actually laying hands on you, you're not in an abusive home. I mean, it's much better than that other family, right? Like, it's not bad actually being beaten and actually being ripped apart verbally and emotionally, right? So, so there'd be no reason for you in that instance to say, we're in an abusive home, don't seek help. But we would say of both instances, no, it doesn't matter. The degrees are relevant. Abuse is abuse. If it's happening, it's happening, and there must be something done about it. And I think that's
Yeah,
sorry, go.
well, I think it's just very simple. You have to think, in principle, is it true? In principle, is it true that that the Canadian state is above the rule of law? Yes. As a matter of fact, that's not a matter of opinion. It has nothing to do with how they wield that abusive authority. So we can go through all the ways that they do wield that abusive authority. And we're way past the point of establishing the wielding of that abuse, way past. But I'm just saying, as a matter of principle, the Canada is not under the rule of law. Our charter allows for the rulers to set aside the law. We are under the law of the ruled. That is, by definition, tyrannical. That's just a fact.
So we would push it back then. We wouldn't say 10 years, we would say 40 years when the charter was ratified in 19. Yeah. So it's really a 40-year long process of tyranny becoming not only a possibility but an actuality.
Yeah, and I think not everyone realized that. You and I were both, I think, at the meeting with lawyers and pastors waiting for the first court case to drop because we would appeal to the charter and we'd all get out of this mess. Even the lawyers thought that. And I think Bruce Pardy has noted this. I don't think anyone realized that Canadian law has always been such that our laws and customs are predicated on the idea that the authorities are honorable and trustworthy. And so we leave provision for their discretion. But we didn't realize that that same provision can be used by dishonorable and untrustworthy people to set aside the law. And we're seeing that at every level of our judicial system. So our laws, and this is a bigger conversation that's out of my depth. To me, it seems like our laws don't really function as laws, at least how people think they do. There's far more discretion for the rulers themselves to sit above them, whether you call that interpretation or application of the law or whatever. It's like, oh, we don't actually have something solid to appeal to that even the governing authorities themselves are under, because in a lot of cases, they can just set it aside. So to your point, I think we live in a tyrannical state. And I think the consequence, and if you think about the American Revolution, look, taxation without representation, it was the principle. It wasn't merely the burden of taxation on them that they reached a threshold. It's that these people had fled, their families and ancestors had fled persecution and state tyranny, and they could smell tyranny a mile away. And they said, on principle, the law says that we are owed representation and that we cannot be taxed apart from it. And so if you are going to set aside the law, by definition, you are tyrannical. And we will resist that at this point. And they resisted it at a very on the ground, inconsequential points. But the reason we're in this mess and why tyranny can go unabated is because people don't act on principle. They act on pragmatism. Same with COVID, right? Like, no one opposed the mandates as long as they could work from home and get their groceries delivered and have all their comforts. They didn't say this is wrong in principle. They just said, how does it affect me? Mm-hmm. So I just think if that's how you act, it's dishonorable. It's, you need to act in principle, because what we're advocating for is not an overthrow of the state in some anarchistic way, but it's actually the reestablishing of the rule of law.
we're not what you're advocating for is not a French Revolution. It's
No.
an American War of Independence type thing.
Yeah.
It's you are no longer functioning according to our agreement, and therefore something must be done about it. And I think what makes people feel icky, if I can use that, is, and you've already alluded, we've kind of grown up in a world where we understand that all of the power and ultimately all of the ability to make these big moves resides solely with the state. And our
Yes.
job as citizens is just to kind of be plebs and do what we're told, and they'll take care of us, which is kind of, it's historically Canadian. I think that's a historically Canadian kind of perspective, where that streak doesn't exist so much in the United States, where they recognize, well, no, it's the like the king, the prime minister, is not above the law. The law is above him, and the people ultimately, like, he serves them, right? He's supposed to
Yes.
serve the people.
It's really been exposed in the last 5 years that Canada is founded on the idea that the greatest threat to the nation is the people. And it is not the governing class, whereas America is founded on the complete opposite assumption. The greatest threat to the people is the state. And that is a truthful claim. It corresponds with reality. If you think about the bloodbaths of the last century, which are greater than all of the wars in human history put together, it was state-led. And
Yeah.
so Canada has
Who
created
takes the guns
customs.
from who, and then who then
Canada has
puts those
created
people in
customs.
prison?
Yeah, Canadians overall genuinely think, we're the people who literally take away hunting rifles to stop, gangsters from shooting each other in Toronto. Like, it's the craziest thing, but it's because we believe that the state has our interests at heart. If we just do what they say, it's for our good. And the greatest threat is personal responsibility. The greatest threat would be the peasants. And that's actually very deeply ingrained in our history, sadly, in our ruling class, I should say, not in our rural culture.
Mm-hmm.
So,
which coincides with the charter, because then the state can say, because you are a danger to yourself, and because you're not able to be responsible with your rights, we can override them ultimately in order to do what's best and care for you, because you neither have the ability and shouldn't really be trusted with the responsibility to make these decisions on your own. We'll make them for you. And, oh, look, we have a provision in the charter that we can suspend your rights for your good, ultimately,
yeah,
for your well-being.
the assumption is that the state can grant and take away rights for the good of the nation. But that's a tyrannical idea. That's to ascribe to the state godlike status. So anyways, this is built into the cake. This is not me talking about some story in the news or some decision I didn't like. I'm saying that systemically, functionally, Canada is a lawless state. Not that we have no laws or that we never enforce the law, but that ultimately the state is above the law. That's demonstrable. And that is tyrannical. And they can wield that and do when they see fit. And so the question for us is then, strategically, what do you do about it? And my suggestion is, you don't wait until you can do nothing about it. You don't say nothing until every censorship bill comes through and X is not allowed in Canada, and your signal is being monitored. Like, you don't wait until, oh, I guess that's pretty bad. Well, yeah, and what are you going to do about it? So if we want a peaceful resolution, which we do, then this is the time to be speaking up, to be saying something. And I think the threat, like leveraging the present moment with America is part of that. It's like, we need to, when you treat Donald Trump like your greatest threat, and he is a threat to Canada, but when you treat him like the biggest threat, you are siding with your enemies, which is your state and the ruling class, and you are perpetuating tyranny. We need to look at ourselves, and we need to say the only reason he can even be implementing these tariffs is because of the suicidal policies that we have been implementing for 10 years. landlocking our resources, canceling our pipelines, making us 100% dependent almost on one buyer. It's absolutely insane. And now their solution is to, tax us harder and state subsidize our economy. Like, that's communism.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to not give into the play. We need to use this as an opportunity to rally together against, in opposition to, a tyrannical, godless state. Not just against Donald Trump.
So I'm curious to hear your perspective on the, and I guess I'll be clear at the onset so that no one does indeed accuse us of seditious or treasonous speech. We're not doing that. We are saying, in the realm of principle, what would be the moral rightness or wrongness of either seeking extranational help or outside help imposing itself? Is that something in principle that Canadians should either support or oppose or seek out when the tyranny is so great? And maybe to frame that, the thing about this family analogy again, my wife and I were talking about this the other day when we were driving in the car. So suppose you have a family, and in that family, the father is the kind of jurisdictional authority in that sphere. And so his authority by other people, both in the family and outside of the family, can't simply override it, because you can't have someone, the pastor can't tell the father, how to do Bible studies. The state can't tell the father how to discipline his kids if he's doing it correctly. So he has the jurisdiction. Now, suppose in that family he is being supremely abusive. It's that first family example I gave. But he's doing it in such a way that there's really no recourse for the family, right? If they call the cops, the police come and investigate, and he's doing it such that there's no evidence, so there's no proof. So any claims fall on deaf ears. He's not actually punished. There's no legal recourse. There's no person that they can go to who has been given the authority to step in to do something. And perhaps even within the family, you have some people who, for various reasons, don't want anything to change, right? They don't want anyone else to help. They're content as they can be in the abuse. So that's a situation. Now, suppose that family is a neighbor or a friend. We have an existing relationship with them, and we know this is going on. The authorities will do nothing. And maybe the people inside the family are saying, listen, don't do anything, whatever, we'll just deal with it. Do we have a moral obligation to impose ourselves and essentially override this man's authority for the sake of the family? Would that be right? Even if the people aren't necessarily asking for it. And obviously families and nations are different. But I'm trying to think, if in establishing principles, is there ever a point where the leaders within a jurisdictional authority, because of their operation, it not only is right, but probably the moral requirement for someone who is a vested in that family and a relationship to step in and impose themselves upon that authority and say, we are removing you, or we're removing your family, because we've come to the point where this is the only course of action.
Yes. So I think this goes into the idea of how authority and responsibility work. So I think in Scripture, all human authority is limited. And we see that by even the disciples setting aside the commands of the state in order to obey God. And not that they always set them aside, but when they contradicted God's laws and commands, then they saw that God's law and commands trumps. And I would say the same thing happens on a human level, that we obey our leaders in as much as they only require of us within the limits of their jurisdiction, and also in line with what God commands. So when they don't do that, when they overstep, the question is, what do we do? And I would say the Christian always wants to work within God-ordained authority structures to maintain order, right? So we don't want a French Revolution. We don't justify lawlessness because of lawlessness. So one of the ways the Protestants have worked this out is through the doctrine of the lesser magistrates. It's saying that there's not only one God-ordained authority in the state, that there are actually multiple God-ordained authorities, that even if the state is God-ordained, then that means at every level of the state. So in our country, that's the federal, the provincial, the municipal. And I would say down from there, you go family and individual. I think the individual is God-ordained, and that our conscience is subject ultimately to God and not the collective. So practically putting this together, this is one reason I'm opposed to simply asking for a bailout without doing anything from the Americans. Because I think that Canada's problem is that Canada is Canadians abdicate their responsibility, and we're a socialist country and we like that. And then when things we go along with everything we shouldn't until we don't like it, and then we complain. Well, you don't deserve freedom if you don't fight for it. And so even though in principle I'm open to the idea of support to reestablish the rule of law, I think that it can only come on the backs of a meaningful resistance by those who are responsible. Lesser magistrates, I think we appeal to. So if there was a provincial leader, if there was a federal politician who was a Christian that you could rally behind and get a lot of support for to be a big voice, if there was a municipal, I think what might end up happening with these tariffs, I mean, if Carney gets in, it's looking like he might, almost certainly he would have to cave on his whole policy. But if he didn't, Alberta will have a referendum, and they will cease to relate to the Dominion the way that they have, whether that is by becoming a state or their own nation or something else entirely. I'm not quite sure. Well, that's a leverage point, and that's also a lesser magistrate to rally to. So I'm just trying to be clear that just because I think that there needs to be a resistance to tyranny and that it's lawful to get help in that regard. Look, the American War of Independence, like, they were helped by the French. Okay, let's not get this twisted. It wasn't just the Patriots. So yeah,
Are you saying we need the French to help us? Is that what you're
no.
saying?
I'm saying
I'm not ready. I'm not ready for that. I think let's embrace the full on tyranny of Carney before we get help from the French.
Yeah. It would have to be a sad day where Alex Kloosterman called on the French for help, for sure. But my dad raised me better than that. No, I'm just saying there could be an appeal process to the lesser magistrate. I do know for certain, though, what needs to happen is Canadians need to draw a line in the sand and say that our state is tyrannical. Our state we are not governed by the rule of law, and that needs to be established. And we do that beginning with our words. And I don't even see that happening at all. And even Christians and pastors, I see private mumbling and grumbling, and some appeals to America, and it's like, this is pathetic. The American War of Independence, the British called it the Presbyterian Rebellion. Like, this was led by pastors, not through force of arms at first, but through pleading with hearts and minds, to explaining the moral principles here.
Which is also the case during COVID. I mean, by and large, I would say
it was.
The largest resistance, at least initially and continually during COVID, were pastors who understood the role of the state, which is why we were best positioned to say you're not doing your job. So that shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone who understands history that this has usually always been the case.
Yeah, exactly. So that needs to happen.
So, a couple points of agreement. Yes, we are functionally ruled by tyrants, and I think that is very difficult to deny once you work through things objectively. Like on our show, referred to, or back in the past, we referred to Justin Trudeau. I would call him our prime tyrant, our prime fascist, and some people took a little bit of umbrage with that. And people who would say, well, that's that's disrespectful, I would say to them, no, you don't understand. He is a tyrant. Like, functionally, he is a tyrant. So by calling him a prime tyrant, I am describing him accurately. By calling him a prime fascist, I'm describing him accurately, because that's what he wants. He wants the state to control all things and let people live under the guise of we still own our businesses, even though he wants to bring about a command and control kind of economy. So that's very much the case. And so being honest about it is something we need to, right, we just need to agree that this is the condition. And the last 5 years put that on blast. And the only thing that's changed is the degree, right? The structures haven't changed. The operation hasn't changed. It's just the degree of the tyranny, so to speak, that's changed. Another thing you alluded to that is an important discussion, and you and I talked about this in person, is Canada and Canadians most definitely have not done everything they can do yet. Not even close. Not even we haven't even scratched the surface of doing everything we can do to save our own country before we beg the United States to come and save us. And one of the things I mentioned to you is that a lot of the people who might be just clamoring for United States come and annex us, come and free us, might be the same sort of people who decided not to leave during the most intense tyranny. And there's a part of me that perceives some of the decision is they maybe wanted to leave because it was bad, but for whatever reason decided to stay. But now, if there's an opportunity for the United States to come and save us, then they'll get kind of what they wanted all along, which was to be in the States, but to bring the States here to us without having fought as hard as we can. And so I guess the question I want to ask you is, what does that, maybe give a few points for people to consider. What does it mean for us to do everything we can do, or for us to take responsibility as citizens to try and resist, but also to build and be faithful and be patriotic, that we're not doing, that we need to start doing, and we need to work as hard as we can and pursue every avenue that if then we come against a wall and we fail after doing all we've done, then maybe it's more understandable to say, okay, now we really do need the outside help. Because I think we've just started having the discussions about what to do. But what are those things that you okay, it's time for us to get to work to do all of the things that we can do in our power to try to bring righteousness and the rule of law back to Canada?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is that we need to establish a principled flag. And so there needs to be an explicit articulation about the nature of a nation, the nature of patriotism, the nature of the rule of law, the nature of tyranny, and a clear moral stance on where we are at as a nation before there's any discussion of strategy moving forward. And that just hasn't happened. And that takes a lot of work, and it involves putting your neck out there, and it involves trouble. And a lot of people don't want to do that, or don't have time to do that, but it actually needs to be done. So I think that is a fundamental issue. There needs to be a moral, theological, philosophical, principled flag in the dirt that people can rally around. And then you look at the people that you have there on principle, and you go from there. And you look at the landscape, and you look at the threats, and you go from there. But to me, discussions of strategy are way downstream from that, and they're kind of the easy decision. Like, it's like with COVID, once you establish that Caesar is not Lord, that Jesus is, the decisions are pretty easy. Like, we're going to meet this week, okay, so some of us in the forest, some of us in the field, some of us in our building, there's conversations to happen there, but they're pretty straightforward. The circumstances kind of dictate them for us. It's more establishing at a principled position. It's coming to a principled position and establishing your moral framework, which takes the work and the resolve and the character. So I think what needs to happen is for Christian pastors, especially, to come together and to establish some kind of public statement that's purpose is instructive, not just declarative. Explaining
The same
and
way they did with the Niagara Declaration, for example.
yeah,
Same kind of
yeah,
idea. Yeah.
yeah, explaining these things from scripture, applying them to a present situation, and trying to teach and instruct and disciple people in these matters. And then you see what God does, and you see where you go from there, and you see how the state responds, and all of these things. But that's, I would say, 100% of our energy and efforts presently has to be there.
So it's essentially a repeat of 5 years ago, where after the initial shock of a virus from China that's maybe more deadly than we think, and the initial shock, okay, we'll give the benefit of the doubt for a bit. We've got to figure this out. Once that had settled, and we realized that they were just going to push the lockdowns as long as they wanted and print as much money as they wanted. Part of our battle was trying to convince people, you need to understand the situation, right? You need to understand our current circumstance, which is 5 years ago, we do not have a state health apparatus that's actually working for our good. We don't have a media apparatus that's honestly telling us what's happening. And people were asleep on that. And people are still asleep on that, but the overt COVID tyranny has subsided. The reason I say it's a repeat is because we're in a position now where we're similarly telling people, you have to understand where we are. Like, we are not in Canada in the 1950s. We're not in Canada 50 years ago. This is our present situation is we are governed by tyrants and unelected bureaucrats who are essentially working for their benefit or for the benefit of their overlords and power brokers behind the scenes, and not. I mean, the story about the father and the vaccine injury, it's so mind-boggling that public health would say they're not accountable for what they do as it relates to the health of the public. I mean, that's just so
I don't
1984.
Well, the thing is, so my position is you need to establish your principles, and tyranny can be tyranny even when it is not fully expressed.
Right.
And what we need to do first and foremost is not look around and point out the expressions of tyranny, but we need to first establish the definition of tyranny. Because once you do, which is when a man places himself above the law, that is tyranny. And Canada is a tyrannical state, and that our ruling class is above the law, that we don't have a law over the ruling class. That is easily demonstrable. Then you can show all those other things.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the irrefutable reality of the situation. Having said that, you could take 5 minutes and demonstrate that the ruling class have wielded their authority in tyrannical, authoritarian ways. I mean, the convoy was a great example. They lied. The courts lied. They didn't tell the truth. They set aside the law. They just said, we don't have to justify our well, you didn't meet the legal threshold that CSIS said it wasn't a problem. It doesn't matter. We can make up new thresholds. So, like, we don't even, we're not dealing with a theoretical situation.
Yeah.
And that's like, even if you look at the state of taxation in Canada, I think is it's immoral objectively. You look at abortion and MAID, the right to life and the dignity of every human being is a fundamental basis of every right and every law. So if we don't even uphold that fundamental right, then our laws are by definition insufficient. So in 5 minutes, you can demonstrate how this tyranny, which is objectively true systemically, has been played out practically, subjectively on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
But again, you need to establish first principles, and realize that to come back circle, that does place a burden of responsibility on you as a citizen. I grew up every day singing that I stand on guard for thee every day in my school. I had to take off my hat. I had to be quiet. I had to sing those words, and I actually meant them. And the question I have for other Canadians is, what do you mean by that? And if you think that the only enemy you stand against is the enemy without, you're an idiot. The people that we have to stand against are the traitors in our own ranks. And so you have been psyoped into thinking by the people who hate you and by the true tyrants who are destroying our country, the seditious people, that the only enemy is without. And that's what tyrants do.
Yeah, that's the abusive family situation as well. The abusive father is the one who says, it's the people I want to help you, that they're the enemies, that I love you, I'm the dad, I provide for you, I bring home the money, look, you have a home, you have food, you have clothing. People want to break us up. It's people outside, but that's the real enemy. The real enemy is the one inside the home. That's the real threat to the family. And people, I mean, you're right, man. People have to. Part of our not just social media engagement and part of the way that we all need to operate personally, even in ministry, is, I mean, we need to be about truth, right? The reality is that people who follow Christ are those who've been freed from the kingdom of darkness into light, and we have been given a mandate to expose, right? Like darkness can't remain hidden forever. We need to expose it. We need to shine a light into the darkness. We need to shine a light into people's eyes sometimes who would rather be in a dark closet, and reveal to them what's actually going on. And I think we can be no longer silent about or awkward about saying that we are definitively governed by tyrants. This is irrefutable. This is our present situation, and we need to be open about that in the hopes that more people wake up to that.
The Canadian state is a tyrannical state, is what I would say.
Yes. Yeah. No, you're right that we don't even have to talk about degrees. We can just we can start right at 1 degree and show how this is our situation. I have like 2 more questions I want to ask you if you're able to stick around for a bit. But before I do that, I want to say goodbye to our Rumble and YouTube audience, and also people who are not paid subscribers. So for those of you, I want to thank you so much for joining us on Liberty Dispatch Interviews. Alex, give you a quick moment now. Where can people connect with either what you're doing or specifically direct them towards Dominion Press stuff, Resistance Coffee stuff, before we head back and have a couple more questions?
Yeah, a lot of what I'm doing publicly, I mean, my main commitments are to my family and my church, Hill City Baptist in Peterborough. But we have a podcast, dominionpress.ca is where you could find that. Articles, fleshing these things out, kind of the vision, the biblical vision for life that we have, dominionpress.ca. And we also have a coffee company for those who are sick of the burnt and bitter aftertaste of communism. resistancecoffee.ca.
All right. Well, again, those of you who are joining and who are going to be exiting, head over to ldcanada.substack.com, and that is where you can become a paid subscriber. You get the rest of this conversation, all of our full interviews, and for all of you, until next time, Galatians 5:1. Liberty Dispatch has been brought to you by SDG Media. If you want to stay in touch with us and all things Liberty Dispatch, join our email list or support the show, head over to ldcanada.substack.com.